All right, we are live. Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings to the Commander-in-Chief and the President of the Economic Freedom Fighters, officials, commissars, fighters and ground forces, sympathizers and supporters of the economic emancipation movement, Africans in the continent and Africans in the diaspora. I greet you all in the name of economic freedom in our lifetime. My name is Nompumelelo Simango, and I'm truly honored to be the host for today's webinar on women and children's rights, a continuation of the EFF Women's Month series. Today, I'm not alone. I'm joined by sexual reproductive health expert, Dr. Tlaleng, also known as Dr. T in the streets. And I'm joined by Ms. Tshepo Fokane from the Alliance for Rural Democracy Trust. And I'm joined also by our former national chairperson, our first national chairperson, advocate, Dali Mpofu. We're going to be speaking on these issues. During the month of August, the organization took time to speak to women. We spoke to women that were brutalized by the state through a practice known as coerced or forced sterilization. We spoke to women who have been failed by the justice system. We spoke to women who are farm workers, rural farm workers, domestic workers, mine workers and sex workers. So we spoke to women all over South Africa, just trying to highlight during this month the challenges that different women in South Africa are facing. So I'm going to be speaking to the panelists today, the beautiful panelists, who are going to just expound with me on the issues that are facing women in South Africa. And maybe we can just start on what has been in the news cycles predominantly over the past couple of months, which is the issue of coerced or forced sterilization, okay? So the report for the Commission of Gender Equality, which investigated the sterilization of HIV-positive women against their wishes, was made public on the 24th of February, 2020. Now, the report made a number of recommendations, and one of these is that the Commission would refer the report to a number of institutions such as the Health Profession Council of South Africa, the South African Nursing Council, the National Department of Health, and the South African Law Reform Commission, either for amendments to the legislation or for the institutions to conduct their own internal investigations against the healthcare practitioners who are implicated in the report. So maybe let me just start with Advocate Dali Mpofu. And you can just give us a brief on the constitutional mandate of the CGE as a Chapter 9 institution. If these recommendations do not happen as set out in the report, what is the mandate of the CGE in ensuring that these women who are coerced or forcefully sterilized receive justice?
Yes, thank you very much. I also greet everyone, the leadership and my fellow panelists. Yeah, just to get right into it, I just want to maybe start by situating the discussion. Because I think the EFF has spearheaded this issue very well from the beginning of this month. And we are, as always, hoping that, you know, campaigns such as this must not just be confined to Women's Day or Women's Month, or, you know, but it must be an ongoing campaign. Speaking for myself, and I hope for all of us, we must be lobbying our leadership that something like maybe next year at the plenum, this should be one of the issues that is highlighted, and we make it part of our theme for the year. Now, I think what's also important is to locate this within the broader framework of the EFF's political outlook. I think it's pillar number 4, that deals with the question of healthcare, free healthcare. So in this context, when we talk about free healthcare, we're not just talking about free in terms of money, but we talk about free healthcare in the context of freedom, liberty, and as you just mentioned, constitutionalism. So I think that's also a crucial aspect of it. I think the other thing that I just wanted to say generally is that the EFF has also defined, if you like, the sites or pillars of how we campaign around issues as using the 3 platforms, namely the courts, parliament, and the streets, so to speak. So again, this is a campaign that must happen in all those places at the same time. So it mustn't just be health, as in just claiming for damages issue, or just a legal issue. It must be a campaign, a political campaign, also to create awareness. Coming specifically to your question, the Gender Commission, like all other Chapter 9 institutions, is an entity that is meant to create awareness, to promote human rights generally in a specific area, in this case, gender-based discrimination. And therefore, it is part of their mandate to take up issues such as this specifically. It's not even negotiable as to where it belongs. But of course, they work with other like-minded institutions. So, for example, an issue might be taken to the Gender Commission. They might decide that it has broader human rights ramifications and refer it or collaborate with the Human Rights Commission. They might find that it involves specific violations or corruption or fraud or whatever it is, and refer it to the public protector and so on. So these institutions work in collaboration. They might even recommend prosecutions, or that the thing should go to court, or a particular minister has failed to do what they need to do, and therefore remedial action, how that particular minister must do. So it's a whole debate that we must have as to how we can take advantage of those particular institutions, such as the Gender Commission. Also because, as it happens, they report to Parliament. So they are accountable to Parliament. So our MPs can then follow up and ask for specific things, give them a list to say, look, you must do this within 3 months. When you come back here, you must have done this, that, and the other. So the CGE is an important mechanism for accountability in that sense.
All right. Thank you so much, Advocate. Maybe coming to you, Dr. Tlaleng, in terms of the sexual reproductive health rights, and maybe just so that the viewer, where there's poor access to quality healthcare, can understand what is sterilization, and in particular, what is coerced sterilization, and how does it affect women?
So sterilization is a medical procedure that is done or when it is done, a person can no longer get pregnant or carry a pregnancy. And depending on what is done, there may be different implications. So for example, if you are sterilized, it's important to know that it's permanent, especially when it's being done to the female internal organs. The tubes may be tied, and the tubes are the places where the egg goes through before it goes into the uterus. And if the tubes are tied, it means the egg has no way to get to the uterus for implantation of pregnancy to happen. So that's how, when the tubes are tied, you are sterilized. Sometimes, for different reasons, someone's womb may be removed, which is what is called a hysterectomy. Sometimes it's removed because you want to be sterilized, and as part of the sterilization procedure, they take out your womb or they do the hysterectomy. Sometimes you have other gynecological problems that you have to treat, and as part of treating those gynecological problems, you then remove a womb or have the hysterectomy, and then you are sterile, right? It's important to understand that with medical ethics, it's important that any doctor or any nurse or any healthcare provider has legal duties to make sure that they explain the procedure to a patient, they explain why they need it, they explain to them what other options of treatment are available, and that they then explain to the person any complications immediately and then in the long term that they may expect. And the person needs to know where to go should those complications then happen. It's important in the medical industry to understand that, especially with patient care, informed consent is a human right that we all have. And this is informed consent for anything that happens to you, including medical treatment, whether it's medical or surgical treatment. And for us to say that if Mpumi goes to the doctor and she has this operation, she gave informed consent, there are certain basic things that me and you would have needed to discuss for us to then say, yes, Mpumi gave informed consent for this procedure to happen. Yes. Now, where the issue of coercion or forcing people comes in is because all of us have a right to make decisions about our bodies. Yes. All of us have a right to decide what happens to our bodies, just like we have a right, even if you're talking about sexual violence and harassment, right? All of those things are speaking to our own right to decide what happens to our body. Similarly, with your healthcare needs, you have a right to decide if you want to get pregnant, how many children you want. And even when you are then pregnant, you still have a right to talk to your doctor and decide what are the best methods of me giving birth. And your doctor is the one, and your nurse is best placed to say to you, look, because of 1, 2, 3, 4 reasons, definitely you can try have a vaginal birth. Or while you are having a vaginal birth, they may say, look, we have a few concerns, and because of 1, 2, 3 concerns, we are going to recommend that you have a cesarean section, right? Birthing via an operation. And you then sign the form, they tell you what's going to happen, and you write your name, they write their name, you sign, there's a witness, there's a date to it, right? And they write clearly what procedure is going to happen. And what's important is that with every medical procedure and surgical procedure, there has to be a discussion of what can go wrong and what will we have to do to manage and fix if anything goes wrong. And some of the things can go wrong immediately during the operation, and every patient has a right to know what are those common complications that may potentially happen, and they need to already, before they have the operation, especially when you don't have the ability to then be conscious and give further details or comment while you are having an operation, it's important to then have this discussion with your doctor and agree beforehand. And coerced sterilization or forced sterilization is actually classified by the United Nations and the WHO as inhumane, as cruel, and as something that should not happen. And there are already grounds for discrimination that already exist. So gender discrimination is something that's already existing in human rights law, as well as health status are already grounds for discrimination. So if someone is a woman who's HIV positive, we know already that there are certain vulnerabilities that they have, and we need to then protect and promote their human rights. So forced sterilization of HIV positive women, it's already existing grounds for discrimination. We already know that that is wrong. It's already been established. It's about how to deal with the individual cases of women who this has happened to then look at the specific details of when and how and who was involved and which facilities and so on. But it should never happen that anyone has any medical procedure that they don't fully understand what it is, why they need it, what are the other alternatives, and then know the complications thereof. And what's important is in medicine, and Advocate Mpofu will tell us, and we get taught this in medical school, if you didn't write anything down as a doctor or a nurse on your patients and your patient care, you can't then say to court, but I gave Mpumi Panado, but you didn't write that you gave her Panado. So omission is also negligence in medicine. And it's important to understand that when your file goes missing or the consent form is incomplete, legally that is something that is not okay, even in medicine, and we are taught that. So it's important that to facilitate informed consent, people's documentation needs to also prove that informed consent was facilitated and informed consent was then given.
Thank you so much, Dr. T. So before I get to you, Tsepo, I just want to go back quickly to the advocate. You know, Dr. T ended her thought with alluding to the fact that there's lost files, and these are some of the stories that we heard when we were speaking to the women who were coerced or forcefully sterilized. Now, with the lost files, some of them are even afraid to even pursue the matter, to even chase for justice. Is this a real fear? Is this something that should be feared? Or is there a way in which the law of South Africa can protect these women so that they find justice even without the files, the lost files that are claimed by the medical practitioners? Advocate, you are muted.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Bumi. Yes, I'm glad that you came back to me, because I really wanted to kind of follow up on the last comments of Dr. T. Look, I think again it goes back to where we started to say, I'm really glad that this conversation should involve the kind of multidisciplinary team that we have here, because all of us, it needs the victims, obviously. It needs activists, you know, it needs lawyers, it needs doctors, it needs the community. And in fact, I think that's how it should always be approached, in a multidisciplinary way. Now, if we zero in on this question of documentation that Dr. T was talking about, it's very important. In law, obviously, we know that evidence is important. So as she was saying, you know, if you give me a Panado now, in 5 years' time, nobody might remember if you gave me 2 or 3 Panados. But so the evidence that is on the script is what will then determine what actually happened. So it's very important. And the lost files issue is a big one, because it also affects one of the biggest obstacles in this field, especially in relation to claiming damages, is something called prescription, which is just a medical, well, it's a medical term, it's a medical or legal term for you've run out of time. Your claim has become stay, to put it in simple English. So, you know, the ability to get documents or not, the inability to get documents might affect that issue of prescription and the ability to claim. But the way we are looking at it now is we are doing 2 things. We're trying to have a separate case for those people who will have those claims, but also a different one for what we call constitutional violations. So if you like, think of the case, the biggest medical case in South Africa was the TAC case, where the state was taken to court to say you are failing to provide, or rather to comply with the Constitution in relation to this and that and the other. So we are also thinking of doing that, and in that field, prescription will not affect the claims, because that's a constitutional claim as opposed to a claim for damages. But just quickly, the last point I wanted to make, follow up on Dr. T's input, is that this concept of informed consent is very important. And that's one of the angles from a legal point of view that we seek, and we're going to be talking to the medical people and so on. Because there is a big difference between written consent, which is what we are talking about now. In other words, did you sign the thing that says yes or no? That's the first step. But informed consent legally goes much further than that, because I might sign something, but the question becomes, did I sign it voluntarily? And in the area of coerced sterilization, that's a particularly important question, because firstly, most women who actually did sign, on proper examination, you find that signature was not real informed consent, either because the issues were not explained to the person properly, or it was involuntary in the sense that, you know, for example, some of the stories, the people get mocked in the ward oh no, yeah, HIV, we're tired of you HIV people with and so on. And anyway, why do you even want to have children? Just sign here. I mean, under those conditions, you just sign because you think, oh, well, these people know what they're talking about. Yeah. They tell you that everybody does it or whatever. So that's not informed consent. And that subject alone, you can have a whole seminar on it, of informed consent and what it entails, whether it is real consent and so on. And those are the kinds of things that can be tested in court. So even when you have a piece of paper with your signature, doesn't necessarily mean that there was informed consent.
Thank you so much, Advocate. So coming to you, Tsepo, I'm sure you thought I had forgotten about you, but no. In the Gender, Land and Asset Survey, the International Center for Research on Women quotes from the research conducted by Macintosh in KZN, which found that unmarried women could be considered for land rights by traditional authorities if they have a son whose name the land could be allocated to. So now we have women that we've spoken to from rural parts of KZN who also were forcibly sterilized. And of course, what is the relationship between gender and land rights? And now that they've been forcefully sterilized, obviously they can't bear the prerequisite son because of the violation. So from that, what is the relationship between gender and land rights in South Africa?
Thanks, Mpumi, and thanks for the platform. Really, that experience of KwaZulu is actually across the country. So this webinar comes at a really fantastic time where, as ARD, we've been part of civil society and we've been interviewing rural women because we are part of the process of compiling the shadow report for CEDAW. So CEDAW gave the convention to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women. What we now know is that that experience is countrywide. You cannot hold land, property, livestock in your name unless there's a son, a man, a brother, any man who will speak up for you. And what that essentially means is your identity, your person, your physical bodily integrity, it doesn't matter. We've also spoken to women who will mirror exactly what Dr. T and the advocate are highlighting around how when you make decisions around family planning, sexual and reproductive health and rights, that also has an impact on your land rights, because if you cannot make the decision about your body in the household, you are not going to be able to make the same decisions around household, food production, resources, assets, how they should be used, who should have access, who should, if there's any form of tenure, who should be recognized as having these rights. That interplay is essential. We know all over the global south that women are responsible for the household food production, the unpaid care work. We know all of the ways that women are upholding and sustaining households. So every time that patriarchal practice is being imposed on us, we see that what it means is that we have no voice, right? Yeah. And when you have no voice, you turn to the land where perhaps you could draw or sustain yourself or the family. But what happens when somebody determines or decides for you what should happen? Because that's the truth, and it's countrywide. So KwaZulu is only one area where it may have been well documented, but I assure you this is the case for the women we spoke to in Northern Cape, Eastern Cape, Northwest, Limpopo. This is all over the country. Women's bodies are on the line. This issue now of forced sterilization, it's for me drawing so many parallels when we speak about informed consent. In the land rights and land justice work that we do, we speak to women and communities around free, prior, informed consent. Know what you're consenting to. Don't be, under duress. Don't be put under pressure. Know exactly, like we've been saying, the implications. And this is true of how you use or dispose your land and equally your body. But women who cannot even make decisions about their physical health are not going to be able to make decisions around the household assets.
There seems to be an intersectionality of all the rights, legal rights, reproductive rights, land rights, asset rights. It takes me back to what Kimberly Crenshaw termed as intersectionality, a theory of how different types of discrimination interact, particularly for poor Black women who are discriminated against for being women, number one, for being Black, and for being poor. So now my question, maybe just to follow up on what you were talking about, as the Alliance for Rural Democracy, how then do women, so for example, we interviewed women who are farm workers, right? And they spoke on their challenges to accessing land rights. So how do we then step in? How do we help them defend their land and resource rights as farm workers who also have the constitutional right to own land?
So I think the common thread also is access to information. People need to know the rights. We have a lot of work to do around raising awareness to say, how fitla clinic, you don't sign a piece of paper just because they tell you to. It should be the same as where you live and work. Do not be put under pressure by someone who's holding power and authority, because the difficulty for women on farms is that their right to be there is often tied to the partner who's working there. As soon as that job is terminated, a whole household finds themselves essentially on the streets, irrespective of the fact that there's laws and policies that recognize occupants on farms, laws and policies around labor rights, laws and policies, you know, for children on farms. And most recently, I think there was even one of the NGOs went to court to say we need to have basic services provided by municipality on farms. But people have to have that information to say, no more is it the era ya hore farm owner are no, and you must now drink where your livestock drinks. But people don't know this. They assume hore, how it has been is how it will always be. So what we have a job to do is there's the legal people who have been in court making sure that our rights are enforced. But our work, I think, in advocacy and activism is bring this information forward, you know, especially now under this really difficult time of lockdown. You find that some of our key messaging hasn't always spoken to rural women. It hasn't always been, I think, you know, it wasn't landing on the ears of our grandmothers, our aunts, our cousins, our relatives who are living in very remote or rural areas. You've got patchy network. So this world, online, it excludes a lot of women. It excludes a lot of women for whom the wireless is the first source of information. And what we need is for more information about our rights, the responsibilities of government, where to go to access, you know, assistance, and to begin to, like you said, weave the message, no matter what sector we're in. We must be able to speak up to say, I don't understand what's happening. I shouldn't be forced to make a decision on the spot, be it my land or my body. I have the right to take time, ask advice, ask other women, ask around to say, what does this mean?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tsepo. Dr. T, if I come back to you, if access to land rights is so hard for women, have you dealt with cases of violations for reproductive rights in rural areas, and what sort of violations have taken place in rural areas that we may not know of because it seems like it's remote to us?
It's so important, you know, when you ask that question, because we live in a country that has a constitution whose framework is human rights. And that is what is the common thread between all of us. You know, I'll often hear people say, what about culture? What about morals? What about religion? That's fine. Those are your personal choices. But what connects all of us and what we are holding each other accountable on as citizens and as well as people who are depending on civil services is human rights. And that constitution informs a lot of policy. And if you look at even just accessing contraception as a young woman, it becomes really difficult because we live in a society that's still very patriarchal, that shames young women for even being interested in safer sex, right? But it rewards their male counterparts with saying, macho-ness and malehood is reaffirmed, right, by certain behavior. Yet it's the young rural girl in school uniform who had to leave school early because the clinic closes at 4 just to get contraception, because in fact, much of her sexual experiences are rape and coercion. And that young woman has no one else to tell about the fact that, in fact, I am being abused, and sometimes by their own family members, and sometimes by their own teachers, and of course other strangers in the community. But yet promiscuity is then put onto those young women who are absolutely silenced in terror because they cannot speak and because they know that they will not be believed. So that's just an example of how just a geographical location and the pressure of the society we live in can impact not just your access to healthcare and contraception, but for many people, we are making these decisions and choices about our healthcare because of other pressure. Because again, it's young girls who are going to be kicked out of school because they have a big pregnant stomach. You see what I'm saying? And no one will then, there'll be no consequence for whoever then was involved in that pregnancy too. So your right to education is then also impacted by what happens to your body and the lack of justice and the lack of having societies that are free of violence. Another important one in the medical fraternity is the issue of consent, right? A lot of people know that there's contraception. But if you ask women, especially in the rural areas, they'll tell you to know, right? And some healthcare providers themselves will even say, ubaba uzothini mawuzala uzopreventa. Uyazi ukuthi uyaprevent. You see? So there is this undertone and this other conversations that women are hearing that doesn't enable them and doesn't promote their rights to make decisions about their body. Yes, in policy, it says everyone has a right to make decisions about their body. But in practice, a lot of other external forces are then influencing the ability of women to then make certain choices. It's almost like women are these perpetual minors, right? Remember in the apartheid era, women had to get permission from their husbands to be on contraceptives. And that's how patriarchy works, right? It disempowers women and makes us these perpetual infants who have no agency, right? Who are only experiencing the world through asking for permission and eroding that sense of self, right? So you are only kaleng and complete because of your relation to a man. And we need to question, why is it that as a woman who's an adult in South Africa with a constitutional rights, I can't inherit land because I'm a woman, right? And question that too as part of advocacy, and not only saying women should be able to get pregnant and get sons, but question the very idea that as a woman, I must first be in a relation to a man. And remember, a lot, even in the Bible, that man had lots and lots of children and lots of wives trying to get a heir, right? And everyone was shaming the women. Even in reality, when there's fertility problems in relationship, people blame women. Yet we know that even men have infertility. But because we have these cultures that blame women for not bearing sons, we make it as if it's women. And it's actually not the genetic part of women that determines genitals. It's actually the sperm that determines genitals. So if you are a woman and you keep having girl children, we blame you and say, uzala mantombazane. But genetically, it's actually the sperm, that will determine. So if we don't question these things and give people the right information, we are going to just accept it that, well, as women, we need a son or a brother or an uncle. I'm saying let's question that very idea fundamentally, right? And still respect the idea and the fact that some women are located in those societies and they need those rights, but really question fundamentally why our existence as women, even up to getting land, has to be dependent on our relation to men. And that's why men think they own us. That's why they think we are their property, an extension of their property, because we need them to have land. We need them to decide what happens to our bodies, right? We need them and that's what people think. And so we need to understand the psychology and the power dynamics and how it's so disempowering often how we think of women and therefore how we then make decisions for ourselves. Are they truly ourselves, or are we truly just making really tough decisions and beyond just saying, well, we need a boy or a son and therefore let's do it. I want women to have these choices and the rights regardless of their relationship to men.
What I'm picking up from the conversation is that there is a lack of access to information for many women in the rural areas, and maybe advocates in terms of, I mean, there's already a lack of so much information on so many levels, but what can be done then for rural women to access quality legal services for some of the things that they for access to their land rights and their asset rights? What can be done from a legal perspective?
Yeah, okay, look, going back to the theme of your question, which was the intersectionality of the issues.
Yes.
I think that's a crucial aspect, and I'm glad that we are bringing in particularly questions of land, so that one can understand the interrelationship between all these forms of exploitation. Of course, I mean, what Dr. T is talking about and Tsapo spoke about is from a legal point of view, it's not an exaggeration, this issue about women being property. Actually, our legal system is based on what's something called Roman Dutch law. Now, in Roman law, which is where it all started, it was not like an indirect thing like it is now. Actually, that was it. A slave, a child, and a woman were the property of the man, literally. So it has evolved like that until now. You know, change. We can have all these changes, but actually the mentality is still the same, even though it might not be written in any piece of paper. So, it's a very serious matter. But now, coming back to questions of power, because exploitation is enabled by power dynamics. Any form of exploitation, in the end, is about power and abuse of power of one over another. Now, if you look at it like that, now think of somebody who's a victim of forced sterilization, who is a Black, poor woman who's HIV positive from Anyamazan. So they have about 5, just in that statement, 5 areas of specific discrimination. Discrimination because of class, because they are poor, geographic, which was mentioned, because they come from some far-flung area, race, because they are Black, and HIV status, and maybe pregnancy, which is another form of discrimination. So you have these, it's like, just think of it like this: you're walking and somebody puts a load on your head, and then you walk, and then they put another one, and they put, until you have 6 suitcases to carry. And then, you know, obviously you're going to have to crumble. And therefore, issues of access to legal services must be seen in that context, because that person, the person that we have just described, I mean, doesn't stand a snowball's chance of taking on the Ministry of Health or taking on Baragwanath Hospital or whatever. They are already defeated before they even start. I mean, add language, for example, another issue, which is a crucial issue. The person might have given so-called consent because they didn't even understand. These people were speaking big terms, at a time when you are in labor and you just sign whatever you have to sign. So those are you're quite right, the issues that would need to be unpacked in looking at specific cases. And that is why it's important to have this wide struggle around this issue. But also we mustn't forget the specific stories of individual people. Because each individual person, you might have 5 people and they all signed a document. And so at face value, they all gave consent. But once you speak to each victim, you will realize that victim number 1 was a professor, and therefore they probably knew what was happening. Victim number 2 was an illiterate person or semi-literate person. So what might look like the same problem manifests differently when you speak to real human beings and interrogate their stories thoroughly. So it's not enough to say, oh, well, did they tell you the implications? I mean, one of the key issues, for example, is counseling.
Yeah.
So they would have, I mean, if we had in the ideal world, we would have to have pre-procedure counseling and post-procedure counseling. And the pre-procedure counseling goes to this question of consent. But think about it, even if you have given consent properly, there's no problem.
Yeah.
You might still be traumatized by the experience and need counseling even thereafter, because you might not have realized the full implications of what you are doing. So it's a very wide issue. But bottom line is that the more subjugated and discriminated against you are in terms of the social status, the less the ability to fight back. Hence, it's important to have collective activists, NGOs, and so on to assist those kinds of people.
So one of the things that we covered during the Women's Month series is the issue of decriminalization of sex work in South Africa. And I mean, we've just spoken about the compounded discrimination that Black women in the rural areas face. Now that's added to that load of bags that you are carrying on your shoulders is the fact that you're a sex worker, and sex work in South Africa is criminalized. In the case for decriminalization of sex work in South Africa by Chi Adana, she examines the negative impact that criminalizing prostitution has on sex workers' rights and presents evidence-based arguments to show that South Africa should enact legislation to fully decriminalize sex work. So advocate, maybe just going back to you, what is the positive impact that decriminalizing sex work would have on the lives and rights of sex workers?
Well, obviously, again, it goes back to issues of liberty and self-determination, self-actualization, which are important rights of human beings. As we are saying, women, for women to realize their full potential and humanhood, if you like, all the barriers that we know, and even those that we don't know, must be removed systematically and deliberately. You know, it's not, you can't just do slogans. You have to drill down to specific issues. So let's take sex work here. It's the same thing that Alem was saying about who's actually responsible for uzala amantombazane kind of thing.
Yeah.
Nobody thinks about it like that. And the simple starting point with sex work is it's like when we say there's no corruption without a corruptee. Why is it that the sex worker is criminalized, but the customer, so to speak, is must work scot-free? That's the first starting point. Then you get into deeper issues about work itself. The ability to make a living. Why should you be impeded in your ability to make a living? Then it gets deeper into issues of dignity, human dignity. The stigma that goes with it and all that, and you people get chased around, this and the other, and taming and all that. So all that is a collection of human rights abuses that people face literally on a daily basis. It's not, it's something that in a few hours when people go to street corners or whatever, it's actually going to happen to thousands and thousands of people every single day. And yet, we think that human rights violations is just when you get shot by the police, when you're protesting and so on. Whereas these are things that are happening literally every minute. As we speak now, there's somebody who's being chased out of this, or who's being bullied and not being paid and told to go jump in the lake. What are they going to do? Because when they go to the police station, then they're going to be laughed at. And when they go to the hospital, then they're going, it's just almost a non-existence in a way. Whereas the male counterpart, as I say, who might be doing the same thing and actually causing the doing of the same thing, and even the perpetrator of the violence against those victims is normal, so to speak.
Yeah. Dr. Tlaleng, you've been very active and vocal about the decriminalization of sex work. I think on the 5th of March in 2018 at a multi-party women's caucus summit where you gave an address, you said sex work decriminalization is a sexual and reproductive justice issue. Maybe just walk us through. I mean, we're having a conversation where we want women in the townships, women in the rural areas, women in the suburbs, women all over South Africa to understand what we mean by some of these concepts. So when you say it's a sexual reproductive justice issue, just briefly unpack that for us.
It's important because sex work, in fact, let me start here by saying sex in itself. When you are having sex with someone or you are using the word sex, by definition, it's consensual. We've agreed, someone asked for permission and someone else gave permission for certain things to happen. If that doesn't happen, it's not sex. We need women to also understand. Ne? Sex is only sex because you were asked, can I kiss you? Can we have sex? Are we using a condom? Are we not using a condom? And you said, yes, let's have sex. And this is what is expected to happen. So even something as simple as someone removing a condom while you are having sex, that's unlawful because it goes against what you consented to happen during sex. So the issue of sex work and sex workers and people who are having sex for many different reasons is it's important because all of us have a right to have sex, how we want to have sex, with who we want to have sex, and decide for ourselves what intimacy looks like. So am I having sex with the person because and that for me love is important? Am I having sex with this person because I just also want to have fun? Because also women have a right to have pleasurable sexual experiences, because that's why consent is important, because without consent there is no pleasure at all, right? And so because you have all of these rights to have sex free of violence, to have sex that's not coerced, with safer sex tools, you have a right for someone to ask you consent. If I decide or you decide you want to have sex with me, but before we have sex you say to me, T, listen, I want you to give me $50 for it. And I say, okay, no problem, here it is. And me and you have sex. Why is the government making that its business? Why is the government, not only is it making it its business, but they can throw me into prison because of it. So we are criminalizing adults who are having consensual sex, who are deciding for themselves how they will have this sex and who they will have it with and what other conditions come with it. So that is the fundamental issue when it comes to sex work. Located outside of morals, because I said even when we began here, my morals are not the same as yours. Even if we are friends and you know me and we even go to the same church, our morals are not going to be the same. Our threshold for anything is not going to be the same, which is why we have to talk about it in terms of justice, because then that's about human rights.
Yeah.
And so the issue, and that's why the history of South Africa is so important, and we need to teach this history in schools. People need to understand which colonial laws existed and why they existed to punish, subjugate, and control people.
Yeah.
And why some of those laws were even more enforced, right, and more radicalized during apartheid. And why did we carry some of these laws into the democratic South Africa? Because those laws by design were designed to be anti-Black, to be racist, to be anti-women, sexist, homophobic, right? So we need to make sure that when we say South Africa is a country for all who live in it, all who live in it must be for everybody. You can't judge me based on your morals and then take away my human rights because of your morals, right? And so we need to really, really apply ourselves outside of morality and judgment, but within a human rights framework. And that's what's really important. And remember, the International Labour Organization, which is a United Nations body, already in the 70s classified sex work as work. So when we say sex work is work, it's not a slogan that I like as Dr. T. It is internationally recognized at work. Sex workers who are mostly women, and in South Africa, Black women, and this is why it's a racial issue too, and it's a gendered racialized issue, support up to 7 people with their income. And 4 of those are adults. So sex workers are not only supporting children, they are supporting other adults in their families. So their work is work and it's legitimate, and they need decriminalization to remove the penalty in the law. Because that will mean then they have a chance to actually talk about industry, decide what occupational health and standards are, decide what type of labor assistance and support they require. But they can't do that within a criminalized environment, because by virtue of existing and doing that work, they are already criminal. And we know that the law always disproportionately and very heavily punishes women who are loud, punishes women who dare speak and even enjoy sex. And then how dare you now go against every patriarchal rule and not only enjoy sex, but choose to work as a sex worker and then charge men money for it. You are the worst kind of woman. And we need to understand that there are no bad women. We only have bad laws. And those laws continue to impact Black women very, very, very negatively. And as a Black woman who's a feminist in South Africa, it's absolutely crucial that we always place women who are marginalized in the center. The same way that a domestic worker, a petrol attendant, a mine worker, a cleaner, no one ever has those dreams. But they have rights as workers and they're protected as workers, whether or not you like their work or not. So sex workers are not asking to be liked. They are not asking people to come and join them. All they are saying is we are also human and we have fundamental rights, which currently, because of criminalization, are actually, their abuse is enabled by the state and the current legal framework.
I think what you would have realized throughout the conversation is that I'm trying to put together all the issues that we've been covered so that I don't keep you here for a while. So I wanted to go to Sistepo. There's a practice known as Uktwala or Baibita Chubediso. And in this practice, is the practice still prevalent in South Africa? Do you still see it in rural areas? Is there any progress in doing away with the practice and protecting the rights of these young women? What are the challenges that you sort of encounter in trying to deal with such a challenge in the rural areas?
Thanks, Mpumi. Unfortunately, this practice is very prevalent in rural South Africa, but it's hidden. And why is it hidden? Behind this cloak called culture and custom. So what that means is we currently are facing such an uphill battle. We have something called a traditional courts bill. It's in front of us now. It's a parliamentary process. The problem there is it's going to be regulating how women or people living in rural South Africa will access justice. We have a problem with that othering. If you and me are sitting in cities right now, Why should we be able to access the magistrates court, the high court, all other courts, and yet someone, because of the geographic location, is sitting somewhere else, and there are certain offenses that should only be heard at the traditional court? The problem now is this traditional courts bill, it allows ukutwala to be one of the offenses that it will be able to preside over. Now we've got big concerns there to say, where does the traditional court enter in the basic violation of women's rights? Where should a traditional court or a traditional leader who would be presiding over that court feature when it comes to my rights to democracy and the family's rights to protect and uphold a woman or girl who is a victim of ukutwala? The problem we also have in our country, just the way the advocate described, is that legacy of the Roman Dutch laws and how we are minors. You can even find on communities where you'll never see a woman's name. Hundreds of lists of names, always men. And where the woman's partner had deceased, it would be the son. So now on ukutwala, it's doing the same thing of keeping a woman as a minor, to say that even the family should not go and seek immediate, access to justice at the police or at court. It should first be having matters heard at a traditional court. And you have to exhaust those processes to a court that someone in the city enjoys. The practice is there, it's prevalent, but for as long as whenever we speak, we are being attacked as anti-culture, anti-chiefs, anti-custom, we're not going to go far. We also have not been having an honest conversation in our country to say, what is the role and the function? Yeah, some of the practices. We must separate. Sometimes the practice, somebody as a man would have held land for many other people. Then we've now owned it to say it's a law. We've now decided to adopt and retain all of that Bantustan era, apartheid era, colonial era laws and thinking, to say even that if you're not married as a man, basically you live it. So you must marry. That's why some people are going so far, they are subverting customs and culture and traditions. We've never seen them. It could happen that ukutwala Shubedis had a different understanding or meaning or practice long ago. It could happen. We were not there. We're just going on oral history that's giving us an idea that it was not always in this form. But in its current form, when you've got young women and girls, sometimes well below the age of consent, being bundled away from family, and when the families want to speak, you're saying they go where? To a chief, to a headman. What for? What for? The first port of call should be the choice of the family. If they choose Mapones, let that be a choice for them. It should not now become where we mediate certain practices or activities, and we say that we're going to do it. Where is Sithu when you are violating my rights? Why are we doing that? And so that othering, the difference of the person who's sitting in the township, the person sitting in the city, the person in a rural area, having different experiences and realities is really devastating. But it is out there. Our job is to bring as much awareness and information to people as possible, to say that if you had chosen as a family or an individual to consent, ensure that the rights of the woman or girl are not violated. If you did not consent, seek access to justice, speak out, and let it not be shameful to say, you went and exposed something. Because many times we are claiming that people are exposing things when we don't actually know what the net effect is. Anytime we see women and girls on the receiving end discriminated against, being deprived of opportunities, maybe they have to change schools or pull out of school or find themselves, very young girls marrying much older men. it's also all of that patriarchy and that paternalism. Yauri, women are the child, the minor, the subordinate class, men, you know, the providers. We cannot have that continue, but it is out there, definitely.
Sure. Advocate, there is a case that we encountered during the Women's Month series where a young lady was beaten up, and then her 2-month-old baby was killed by the father. And the guy got 5,000 Rand bail with no conditions and is out on the streets. And I mean, this is generally the thread of our justice system in South Africa in dealing with perpetrators. What informs like a judgment like that? I mean, I'm at home, for example, I'm the one who was beaten and my baby's been killed, and this perpetrator now gets 5,000 Rand bail, is free to walk around the streets, is even free to come to my house. There are no conditions on the bail. What informs such a judgment, and how then do we go about fighting it?
Okay. No, I think, okay, before I answer a question, I just want to go to something that my fellow panelists have spoken about. This whole idea of human rights abuses which are tolerated by society, because that's where the problem is. I mean, remember, as the EFF, we have to, I mean, when we ask people to vote for us, we're asking them literally to intervene, or rather to give us the instruments with which to intervene. In other words, to give us political power in order to change these things that we're talking about. And one of those things, which goes back to your question, is this issue of violence. Because really, ultimately, this is what it is all about. Remember, Lenin says that the state is simply an instrument for the legitimate use of violence. In other words, if I beat you up, I'll be arrested. But if a policeman arrests you, then they are maintaining the law. Or if I lock you up in my office, then I'm committing a crime. But the state can lock you up for 10 years. So it's those kinds of issues that we must internalize, that in order to change this, you need, of course, you must change individual cases and so on. But if you are going to change the system, the very system that we are all talking about, you require a lot more. So when you have a system that tolerates, I mean, I like Tetetti's examples on sex work, because actually sometimes you just have to think, instead of, because we're all conditioned, and as the president said at the Women's Day thing, we have to unlearn some of these, particularly for men. You have to unlearn some of these things that you are the boss of the entire country type of thing, and start thinking it in literal terms, as Dr. T was saying. I mean, if it actually becomes ridiculous if you think of it like that. If you think, okay, here's somebody. Why is it if someone says, I want to have sex on the bed, and the other one says, no, I want to have it on the floor? That's a choice that they make. Nobody arrests anybody for that. But if they say, no, I want to do it for money, and the other one says, I don't want to do it for money, what's the difference? If you look at it at those basic levels, then you realize how ridiculous it is. And you realize that it's more than just about morals. It's also about patriarchy, because the morals are selective. They only punish the woman, but not the man. So it's a collection of all those historical things that Tsepo was talking about, which are ingrained in us. So by the time the magistrate or the judge gives a bail decision, that person is himself or herself a victim of all these things. They already have discounted, they already have all these notions that the victim asked for it. You know, she was wearing a short skirt and all that. They're not going to say it like that, but it's all there. It's part of that decision of whether the bail is going to be 5,000 or 100,000 is part of the socialization. You know, that and the ideological, if it's a black woman, well, then obviously she asked for it, yeah. But if it's the white woman, the victim, well, she's probably a victim, you know, she must be taken quickly to the trauma unit. So all those things which are part of our society play themselves into what might look like a simple decision of bail or no bail. That magistrate might be thinking, what's the point? Yeah, I mean, these people beat each other up every weekend anyway. They rape each other, so I might as well give this low amount of bail. Okay. Yeah, but there's also the issue of bail, again, is an issue on its own, which requires a long discussion, because it's also misunderstood even by those people who get outraged, because the issue of bail is not you know, it's not a punishment. Bail is about what should happen between the commission of the offense and the determination of whether you are guilty or not. So there are indeed issues of liberty, because you might be innocent and you might sit there for 3 years, and then it's found later that actually, no, it was not me who did that, it was bad. So it's a very difficult weighing process. But the amount, and you've touched on a very important issue, the issue of conditions. So it's not as if you must just be in jail or not be in jail. It might well be that you say, okay, you might be innocent, you must be released, but you must not go within a particular distance of the victim, and so on and so on. So those are issues, the checks and balances which can be built into the system. But now nobody does that. They just say, oh, well, 10,000 rand bail or whatever, and the person pays their money, and then they literally go and do the very same thing.
And what recourse is there for the victim then in that case?
Well, there isn't much recourse, because I mean, recourse sometimes might mean you are dead by the time you have to look for recourse, because the person is going to come back and either rape you again. And again, you have to look at the social and political context. I mean, the issue of rape is itself a question of power dynamics, because firstly, the person, I mean, you've actually heard women, we all know of tragic situations where a woman says, I think I told this story, I don't know, recently, about a friend of mine told me that her sister, she found her sister with a whole kind of X wound, whatever it's called, and then said, what the hell, what happened? And she said, no, my husband wanted sex, and I didn't want to give him sex, and so on. And he hit me with this thing, an X on the head. And then the sister says, but what are you talking about? Why are you still here? Why don't you come? Let's go home. I'll take you home. And the woman says, well, if you take me home, are you going to feed my children? You know, those are the realities. Now, that's power. Imagine somebody who has to tolerate that kind of violence simply because economically they are dependent on the male. So those are the people who will not even report, even when a child, a baby, has been raped, for those considerations. And you can blame them, we can moralize and say, oh, well, how can you do that? But if you're not walking in that person's shoes and don't feel the economic situation that they find themselves in, which itself is another form of violence, as it were, you know, you have no right to judge that person, as it were. So what we should do is to remove conditions that can dehumanize a person to that extent of actually tolerating to be hacked with an X on your head?
Just, moving quickly, Dr. Dlaleng, I see that Tepo might have dropped off the call, but moving quickly, mine workers. We interviewed mine workers, women mine workers in Marikana. Some of them were forced into the mines after their husbands were part of the 34 that were massacred in Marikana. But one of the things that mine working women, the challenges that they face is that they lack physical infrastructure such as pollution facilities and change rooms. Their PPEs, they don't meet the needs of female employees, which sometimes compromises their privacy, and a whole range of other sexual reproductive health rights that mine women are exposed to, or their rights are violated. So who holds the mining industry, for example, accountable for these gross violations? What laws exist to protect women in the mines against these gross violations?
Look, I think with the mine, the industry has a ministry, right, of mineral resources, and it is at that level where accountability should be happening. It's important to also just say that I used to be a mining doctor, by the way, many years ago.
Yeah.
And I remember even at the time, being a mine doctor, how incredibly difficult it was for women to thrive in that mining sector. And it's again that issue of policy. Remember in the early 1900s, remember when World War II happened, and a lot of men died in the war. And that's really when women became part of industry, became part of the workforce. But the problem that then happened is that women, or the policy or the way that the workplace was structured and designed, from working hours to policies around leave, to policies around wages, professional development, none of those things actually were updated to meet the needs of the women who were then coming into industry and the workplace, which was never designed for them. And we are now sitting in a situation in 2020 where the history of industry and the workplace hasn't caught up to the fact that right now the majority of the workforce globally and in South Africa is women. So you can look at maternity leave policy, you can look at the issue of gender pay gap, you can look at the issues of sexual harassment in the workplace, you can look at the issue of lack of access to flexibility of working hours, right? For women to then go and be able to take children who are sick to the doctor, to be able to work, at home around the needs of their children. So it's very important to actually have these conversations, understanding that the workplace for every industry was never designed for women. And where women are in industry, we are in hospitality or in service. And so it's important then when you think of the mining industry, that already what's existing is already insufficient for women. When you are adding and compounding that with the industry and the working occupational risk, occupational hazards, it adds another layer of vulnerability and discrimination on women. And I'll give you a very literal example for people to understand how simple some of these concerns are, but so important. I used to have to mediate, right? The unions would come to me and say, Doctor, when I got it, you can help us with this thing. Just help us mediate here. We have teams underground, which are led by a team leader, and the team leader is a man. But the people in his team are mixed between men and women. And the men are saying, we don't want to come to work with these women because they smell. And I'm like, no, wait a minute, excuse me, what do you mean? And they said, no, they smell. Then I speak to women, I said, what is actually happening here? What's going on?
Yeah.
And they explained to me that, doctor, when we are underground, it's hot, you are sweating, right? And you are there for hours and hours and hours. When we are on our period and we are menstruating, We are using pads or tampons. And you've already said that the access to ablution facilities is already limited, especially underground. So when you are on your period, when your blood collects in your pad or tampon, after a few hours, the blood starts to disintegrate.
Yeah.
And it smells. That's what blood is. When you are on your period, that blood smells. Worse when you are in a humid and really hot environment like underground. So we need to think about not just having a policy that says women can be the workforce and go underground and we have all these engineers, but think about how, as a mining industry, are you actually equipping women more than just protective equipment, but equipment around health and wellness too, because menstrual cups, by the way, are a great option because you can wear it for up to 10 hours at a time. And because it's a cup, it collects the blood in the silicone cup, and actually the odor is not bad. And you know, you can try and convince the vice president of health in the mines to understand this, but it will still depend on whether or not they're really committed to gender equality and understanding why women need to thrive. And that's just one example. A menstrual cup given freely to women in the mines immediately improves their own health and wellness. They immediately improves their ability to be productive at work. Never mind all of the other things that their colleagues were saying that were incredibly unfair. But the point is, menstruation is normal, and people who are menstruating are part of the workforce. And how do we assist these people with pain medication, with adequate packs for them when they go underground to know that firstly for themselves, they are well taken care of. So that's just one example. The other problem is that a lot of mining towns or mining communities still depend on the mine facilities for assistance. And I really think this is the one area where I want to stress why corporate companies and industries cannot go to a community, extract from the land what they need, and when they are done, just leave. There are responsibilities that they have, and there are duties that they have to ensure that they don't pollute the water system, because we know that access to clean water is a health determinant. They cannot then discard or pollute the environment with you know, the products that they are using for production. Because we know that children have respiratory problems, they have cognitive learning problems, they have problems with skin because of the environment and the atmosphere. Issues of good nutrition is a problem around mine and mining particularly, because you were saying that even where women are the force, we know this when they go home, it's still women again who must cook and clean and make sure that children do homework. So I do think it's industry's role and responsibility to ensure that the communities from where they operate are uplifted, to ensure that the issues of poverty in those communities are genuinely and intentionally solved by them leading, because they have the expertise, they have the profits. And so that the relationship stops being, well, we are a mine, we are an industry, we are coming here to do you a favor and give you employment. It should be the other way around, where the community says the priorities for us in this community is this and this and this and this, and how is your company, how's your mining going to come here to assist in that, and let the people in those spaces lead in terms of you know, holding the companies and industry responsible. But that's just in a nutshell how something can be so simple, and yet when it's left unsolved can cause immediate discrimination, where men don't want women in their teams to work with, and yet the solution is just really about restoring the dignity of women, giving them proper sanitary options, and really just you know, being deliberate about, you know, ending discrimination and being aware of how one discrimination can lead and make it easy for other types of discrimination to then happen.
Sure. So we cannot exhaust all these issues because there are a number of them, and we've tried to cover them in the month of August. The videos are on our YouTube channel. But just before we let the national chairperson give us the closing remarks, I don't know if our panelists have some parting words surrounding the issue of women's rights and children in South Africa. Maybe let me start with Tsepo.
Hi there, thanks Mpumi. Sorry I dropped off. Network is so patchy some of these days. I think it is really interesting when we think of the extractives and communities and land and women and children, because when we want to see communities receiving compensation, it is more than just the infrastructure, because there's this horrible tendency of the mining and other land-based investors to club together with municipality. Then when it comes to compensation, they quickly just funnel those resources into your IDPs. So you can never really pinpoint to see how did this development in my area benefit us as a community, as people. So what we want to see is recognition of household rights, recognition of individual rights, recognition of customary rights. It is okay to consult with a traditional authority just as a consultation, but the final decision makers should be people who are living, holding, and working that land. Finally, in my lifetime, I am praying to see land to the tillers. I'm praying to see Black rural women in the agricultural value network, all over it, not just as producers, but owning, the means of the production, being able to have their produce taken to market, being more than just these empty vessels that provide the labor. But thank you again for having us on this panel. And I could never do justice by not congratulating Dr. Tlaleng in person to say, Kaniti, this is power and inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you, Tabo. Advocate, maybe you can give us your parting words.
Oh, yes, thank you. I think, thank you, Tabo. I would also want to congratulate, I forgot that one of our panelists is an international in the United Nations. Yeah. Congrats, Dr. T. Yeah, look, I think in closing, what we can say really is that hopefully we will, go back to exactly where we started, to say that this whole campaign, broadly speaking, should not just be confined to August. Which I think we must literally fight. We talk about unlearning old habits. We must also unlearn that habit of, August month, 16 days of this and that, and literally carry these things through. Because ultimately, it's the same. There's only one struggle for equality. Mpumi, I've said that many times in our platforms.
Yes.
It's indivisible. You can't say, I'm just going to fight against racial oppression, or I'm just going to fight against class oppression, or I'm just going to fight against gender oppression, or this or that. It's either you are for equality or you're not for equality. And if you are for equality, then all forms of inequality, hidden and unhidden and so on, must be fought with the same vigor and enthusiasm. Because injustice manifests itself in all these things that have been said, whether it's about land, sex workers, sterilization, and so on. All this is about forms of inequality and abuse of power of one by another, which must just be fought endlessly, without doing it in a particular month or because it's fashionable. It's one broad struggle and one fight. And if we just inculcate that into our activists and ground forces and so on, then it will make the life much easier. And I hope our national chair will, fight for the space that these issues must just always be there. It doesn't matter whatever it is we're discussing, whether it's water or electricity or whatever. These issues of gender inequality must permeate literally every discussion that we're having. Sure.
Thank you so much, Advocate. Dr. Tlaleng, your parting words?
I just want to say that, being vulnerable is a human experience, and we are all vulnerable at some point in our lives whether it's because of age, gender, race, class, disability, being a migrant, you know, being born with HIV as a young person. You know, there's so much that living in a rural area that makes us vulnerable as people. But it doesn't mean that because we are vulnerable, people must take advantage of that vulnerability. And I think that it's for every one of us to do the best we can from wherever we are. I'm doing that in the medical industry. Other people are doing that in academia. And we need to be doing and committed to that vision and really make human rights the thing that binds us. Let my human rights and yours be protected and promoted, and let that be what we are judging each other on. And really make sure that when you are coming up with policies, legal reform, when you are coming up with programs, when we're thinking about innovation and the use of technology, to really be intentional about restoring people's dignity. I think there's so much eroded about us, within us, and even how we relate with each other. You know, speaks to a deep, deep need to do some form of collective healing. And that won't happen if you don't see me, right? So we need to humanize each other and see each other. And it's so, so important that right now, as part of what we do, we have to really be intentional about restoring each other's dignity and really working together for the same vision. And I know that in terms of the kind of pressure, right, and the violence that women are experiencing at the moment, we are completely exhausted. We are completely tired. We are living in fear every single day. And it can't be that it must still be on us as individual women to avoid the violence that happens to us. We also have a right to live in societies that are free of violence. We also want to thrive and not just survive. And that's also our human right. And so for me, it's just to say, can we please just be intentional and think about the positions of power that we hold and really be aware and use those positions to advance human rights for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Dr. Tleleng, to Tepo, to Advocate Dalimpofu. Thank you for gracing us and being part of our panel discussion and just helping us unpack some of these issues in a way that is easily accessible to all women in all corners of South Africa. But just before we close off, I'm going to hand over to the national chairperson so that she can give us the closing address.
Thank you very much, Mpumi, and good afternoon to the panelists. And let me thank you, Dr. T, Sister Tepo, National Chair. You know, predecessor, successor thing. It's always good to be around experts because they get to clarify areas of concern and where you think things might happen in a certain manner. However, to get a proper guidance is always necessary. The reason why we had to have this webinar today was exactly for that reason of clarifying all these things. And we see people getting bail. We see monsters that are raping children coming out of jail. It's rather confusing and we are not so sure of what is happening. Justice is failing us. In actual fact, the state is failing women and children out there. Laws that are governing this country, a national chair quoted the Roman Dutch law or element, that until we repeal these laws that we took from the era of apartheid into the democratic dispensation, we cannot really rid ourselves of these injustices, and these violations are actually perpetuated by some of these laws. And from the EFF side, I want to say today, ever since we've started, we know ever since the formation of the EFF, people started having hope that things will change. And ever since the start of the month of August, when we were listening to stories of women, we have acted. Advocate Dalimpofu is leading a team of lawyers that is going to assist us with the women of sterilization. We are collecting evidence in that regard and everything. We always seek assistance of Dr. T as an expert and a doctor on reproductive health care and the general human rights doctor. So we pleading that you avail yourselves, and you must always make yourselves available as and when we seek guidance from your side. Sister Paul, we are going to bother you a lot, because the issue of rural women is quite prevalent. It's quite important, because as we speak right now, I was watching Bume, the messages that people were sending through as we're streaming live. And they're complaining that, you are talking to us, EFF, we hear you, but there's a woman and a child in the rural area who doesn't have a computer, who doesn't have a smartphone, who doesn't even have data. They don't hear what you're saying. So it then begs a question as to, this has to go further than where we are. And we are always going to need your guidance. We are always going to seek some more information from your good selves in order to help our women and children in the most remote areas. But from the side of the EFF as well, we have intervened on the sex workers industry. There is a report that's still outstanding in Parliament, and we are going to move forward with the issue of decriminalization of sex work, as we have started in a previous Parliament. We're dealing with the issues of sterilization through the Committee of Women. Think about 2 weeks, if not 1 week to come, we will be dealing with the Committee of Women, where we have requested them to get the CGE to come and table the report once more to the committee. And we actually want to know where to from here, because the time frame as they were stipulated by the CGE report have lapsed, and what must happen in terms of Parliament. But it doesn't mean we're going to drop anything we're doing. We're still going to continue with our lawyers led by the national chair. And in terms of dealing with the violations, we're also very strong, and we will be taking the platform in Parliament to deal with all these other violations. There are bills that are justice and also for social development in terms of in terms of shelters. So that aspect is also taken care of. The issue of empowering the police, we are working with the Office of the Minister to see what else can be done in the interim until the laws are amended successfully. We know the process of amending the law in South Africa is rather lengthy, but we need solutions right now, but we are working on that. Going forward with all the stories of women that we have spoken to, which we thank you very, very much for telling your stories as women in South Africa, whether they are survivors of these horrendous crimes and those that were victims and some did not make it out of these atrocities. We thank you very much, but from the day you told the story to a commissar of the EFF, we will walk with you right through until a solution is found, whether through the courts, whether through Parliament, whether the EFF will have to provide a solution at some point, but we will walk through with you and ensure that we don't leave you in limbo. I want to plead to the public, advocate, people must really do public arrest of criminals, because some of the things that are happening, we know rapists, we know abusers, we know people that are violating others, and we plead to the public out there who know of any of the doctors and nurses who are implicated in sterilizing, and now they are busy destroying evidence. Want to tell them that you can do that, but we'll find you. And anyone who's found to be complicit to that crime, you will suffer the consequences. Trust me. We will not sit back, and we are not going to be held back by the issue of documentation in assisting the women. If it means that women must go and get new information and reports from gynecologists, we'll find them. There are so many good doctors out there that can come and work with us in order to provide reports and conclusive evidence on these women that were sterilized. The issues of women who are suffering gender-based violence in South Africa, we are going to be with you. And as and when you feel that the burden is too much, we urge you to come to the EFF offices anywhere in the country. Go to the EFF office, seek for help. Do not sit in silence. Do not die alone. Go to any EFF office to report any gender-based violence. And we should not allow men and women out there, do not allow your neighbor to be violated, to be abused, yet you know about it. Report it to the police, and we'll send a strong message to the police out there. Stop sending women back home. If you don't understand what they say, you must involve other people. It cannot be correct that women, when they come to police stations, are sent back to talk about relationships that don't exist. Dr. T said earlier on, sex is when you have consented to it. If ever you don't consent to anything and you don't agree, which is your right not to agree, you cannot be abused on a basis that you do not agree with a man on whatever they wanted at a particular time. Therefore, we cannot then have the police trying to play mediator in crimes that are meted against women. I want to thank you once more, and thank all the commissars that have participated during this month. Thank you, communications team, for fighting and doing your good work. However, we are not stopping here. This was just the first series of the women violations and all other violations. There's still another series coming up, because all the stories that are coming to the EFF, we want the world to know. We are part of the CEDO. We are part of all the protocols, the AU protocols that are signed by the AU, and conventions with the treaties and by the UN as well. So we cannot die in silence only here in South Africa and think that we're going to deal with these issues. The world must know that South Africa is violating all the protocols, is breaching all the protocols, is breaching all the treaties. So everyone in the world must know that the state of the government in South Africa is actually brutalizing women and children, and we will fight. They will not silence us. We must not be silenced as women. We must not allow anyone to silence us. And thank you very much.